First we begin with Typhoon Cora, which passed to the south of Guam, so I did a loop round it actually, and then moved towards the Japanese Yaeyama and Miyako Islands, where it passed as a Category 5, passing Taiwan and then making landfall in China as a strong Category 4 storm. Cora was rather strong, 175 miles an hour, and its lowest air pressure was apparently 920 millibars, and as it passed close to those islands as a very strong cyclone, no satellite imagery, not much of it anyway. It did do it at 155 miles an hour, that landfall in China, causing $30 million of damages and 272 fatalities, but probably the biggest fact there is that nearly 90,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. Now we move on to Typhoon Maemi in 2003, which formed in the West Pacific. Here's the satellite imagery progression of the storm. Took a pretty similar track actually to the one we've just seen, and passed pretty much over the Yaeyama Island of Japan, and reached Category 5 intensity just before then, and made landfall ultimately in South Korea, which not many storms do, at least not as significant typhoons anyway. 175 miles an hour the max again on this one, 910 millibars the lowest pressure. It made just the one landfall in the end. It must have been very close for Yaeyama, but not quite a landfall. 105 miles an hour it was at its final landfall. Damages $4.8 billion. Adjusted for inflation today, that's 6.2, and nearly 20,000 buildings damaged, as well as 120 fatalities. Here's some imagery of the storm near its peak intensity, passing those Japanese islands. They certainly got battered, but what was worse, it was for Korea, South Korea, where it made landfall as a Category 2. There it is, and there's a ship that seemed to sink in harbour there. Looks like South Korea, where that image was taken. Very strong storm indeed, and that is number 39 on Hurricane Week 2015. Our next storm's a very strange one, Super Typhoon Rita. This is a remarkable storm, but for reasons that you may not think. It started as a tropical storm to the southwest of Guam and became rapidly intensified to become a Category 5 typhoon. Super typhoon out in the West Pacific, but what happens next is rather surprising. It stalled and then turned towards the east, weakening along the way, all the way down to Cat 1 eventually, very briefly, and then back to a Cat 2 for the second time, and then weakened to a Cat 1, and then gradually moved towards the north. And then eventually on July the 18th became a Category 2 again for the third time, and then weakened for a brief period, then strengthened, then weakened, then strengthened, then weakened, all around those Japanese islands, the Ryukyu Islands in the East China Sea. There's its fourth peak as a Cat 2. Oh good lord, what was it doing? At least fourth. I don't know how many times it re-strengthened to Cat 2 in the end. I think it was 6, which must be a record of some sort, but ultimately it moved on to China, where it eventually made a landfall not too far from Beijing actually. So Typhoon Rita lasting, about 20 days or something like that, peaking with winds of 165 miles an hour and a low pressure of 910 millibars. A pretty bad storm as well, where it made landfall, 75 mile an hour landfall it was, $2.52 billion of damages if you adjust it for today's inflation, and 377 fatalities along its treacherous route. Over 50,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed as well, which certainly is a rather serious total. Now we move on to Super Typhoon Winnie in August of 1997, one of goodness knows how many Category 5s that formed that year, passing through the Northern Mariana Islands as a Cat 5, and then moved on to the Japanese Ryukyu Islands, passing through as a Cat 1 just south of Okinawa, and then making landfall in China as a weak Category 1 typhoon with winds of 75 miles an hour. So at peak it was 160 miles an hour, lowest air pressure was 915. A lot of these storms running up around there at the moment in the top 100 here. Just the one landfall, $3.2 billion of damages at the time, mainly in China due to flooding I believe, 4.72 billion adjusted for inflation, 372 people lost their lives as well, very similar numbers to the storm we just saw Rita, even though it may landfall in a different area. Here's some aerial images of the storm. It looked fantastic around its peak intensity when it was right over the Western Pacific, not far from the Mariana Islands. There it is. beautiful storm to look at, obviously much weaker at landfall. And that is number 37 on Hurricane Week 2015, covering the top 100 Category 5 storms.
Wilma is the second of the 4 Category 5 hurricanes that occurred in the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season that is on this list. It holds the record for the lowest air pressure reliably recorded in the Western Hemisphere.
Or at least it used to.
At 882 millibars. Wilma has also broken almost every single rapid intensification record. The only other storm that could possibly compared to its intensification worldwide would be Typhoon Cora, as this storm rapidly intensified from just a tropical storm to a Category 5 in underneath 30 hours. This storm would end up stalling out over the northeastern Yucatan Peninsula and Cozumel, dumping flooding rains over that before turning off to the north and east, making a landfall in Florida as a Category 4 hurricane, weakening once again and racing off to the north and east at over 45 miles per hour.
The strongest, the most intense cyclone ever recorded in the Atlantic, that's right. And let's talk about more after its peak, because we saw its peak, very strong one. Then it went on to, harass Mexico, didn't it?
Basically stalled over the northeastern Yucatan Peninsula for a couple of days, and once it decided to say, alright, I think I've messed up Mexico enough, it just decides, oh, there's a nice little tasty peninsula up there called Florida. I'm just gonna rocket up there battling 14 knots of wind shear, intensify into a major hurricane, and make landfall in Florida. Of course, Wilma is the last major hurricane to make landfall in the United States. It's been over 10 years.
That's a remarkable record.
It's been over 10 years since we've had a major hurricane landfall in the United States. And then after it made landfall in Florida, it continued to rocket up the East Coast, hit major hurricane status again off of the coast of South Carolina, and then went off to the north and east at almost 50 miles per hour, and absorbed the first ever Greek-named storm, Tropical Storm Alpha, as it raced off to the north and
straight there. This is the view from near the southernmost point of Marco Island on the western coast of Florida, and it was in this direction you're looking at that Wilma came ashore from right to left as a Category 3 storm. The hurricane weakened slightly as it moved over land, only to re-intensify shortly after moving back over the Atlantic Ocean. As well as strong winds, a storm surge inundated the Florida Keys. In Florida alone, Wilma caused over $20 billion in damages. Some places haven't been touched since, like this building in Miami Beach.
If you take a look in the record books in the Atlantic, Wilma's there for a lot of it.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Hurricane Janet can be very comparable to a modern-day Hurricane Dean. It had a very similar track, though at a weaker intensity over the eastern Caribbean since it was further south, and a very similar bout of rapid intensification before landfall. The main difference between the two storms is that Dean rapidly intensified from a minimal Cat 4 to a very strong Cat 5, and Janet rapidly intensified from a Cat 1, Cat 2 to a Category 5 in about the same amount of time. Janet also had a much faster forward speed than Dean as well, which caught some people off guard and they weren't able to prepare in time. After it moved over the Yucatan Peninsula, it would move into the Bay of Campeche, where it would make a second landfall in Mexico. Over 1,000 people died due to this storm. Most people regard Hurricane Carla as the largest cyclone to ever exist in the Gulf of Mexico. As it was moving towards the Gulf of Mexico coast, it was able to rapidly intensify into a Category 5 hurricane and had an absolutely immense size and slow movement to boot to it. The reason why damage was quite limited from the storm is because it hit a place in Texas that absolutely nobody lives in. It weakened right before landfall as well, similar to what happened to Hurricane Allen. As the storm moved ashore, it caused very high tides in the Galveston area, highest tides that have been seen since the 1915 hurricane. Only 43 direct deaths can be attributed to the storm and 325 million, but it will be regarded as one of the largest and greatest of all time.
One of the largest evacuations at the time as well, were 500,000 people evacuated from the storm's path. Category 4 landfall at 145 miles an hour, and here are some photographs of what Carla left behind. Number 34 on Hurricane Week 2015. And then in 1958 we had Typhoon Ida, one of the rare members of the 200 Club, this storm reaching wind speeds of over 200 miles an hour when it became a Category 5. A remarkable storm, and then steamed towards Japan and grazed the coast there as a weakening but still significant cyclone, and caused lots of problems there as well. Though it wouldn't be bad as bad as a certain storm a year later. Its minimum air pressure was 877 millibars, remarkable again. Just the one landfall with the wind speeds 120 miles an hour, I think that was in Japan. $50 million of damages in all, adjusted for inflation, that's 409. Over 1,000 fatalities, a terrible storm, and 21,000 buildings damaged or destroyed.
I've already put in my comments on one of the earliest Category 5 hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin. Now I'll put in my comments on the latest. The 1932 Cuba hurricane occurred in the middle of November as it rapidly intensified to a Category 5 hurricane well off the coast of Central America. And it kept Category 5 status for nearly 72 hours before turning up to the north and east and losing only a little bit of its strength before pounding Cuba with winds of over 150 miles per hour. It was just one of those late season storms that moves very slowly over the Caribbean that ended up blowing up. This storm is directly attributed to 3,100 deaths, and there would not be another disaster that would cause anywhere amount of deaths associated to it until Hurricanes Flora and Ike, and not even those storms combined, would amount to the destruction of the 1932 Cuba hurricane.
And now to 1959 and Typhoon Sarah, which peaked as a Category 5 on approach to the Japanese Miyako and Yayama Islands, passing through and then hitting or just about striking the southernmost tip of South Korea on its way out towards the northeast and then stalling over Russia, the next tropical cyclone. Its peak wind speed a massive 190 miles an hour, minimum pressure 905 millibars. Unfortunately, we've got no imagery of this one because it was so long ago. People apparently didn't have cameras in the Pacific back then. 115 miles an hour was its strongest landfall, with $102 million of damages, 2,000 fatalities, and over 50,000 buildings destroyed, mainly in South Korea. And now for one of the Southern Hemisphere's giants, Geralda, which formed in January 1994 in the Indian Ocean and began to slowly move towards the southwest. and eventually would approach Madagascar as a Category 5 hurricane or cyclone. Imagine that bearing down on you, by the way, before making its landfall as a Category 3 storm in Madagascar, the central part of the eastern coast, before moving inland and persisting as a tropical depression for some time. When it did reach its peak, it was quite a peak. It was a wind speed of 165 miles an hour, an air pressure of 905 millibars in the end. But what it did in Madagascar was pretty bad as well. 120 miles an hour was the landfall, $10 million of damages at the time, 304 fatalities in total, and over 140,000 buildings damaged or destroyed. That's probably the highlight number there, the headline in Madagascar, because I suppose that tells you in the biggest volume exactly what happened when the storm made landfall, probably poorly constructed buildings being destroyed en masse there. At number 29 is Typhoon Sally of 1996, which developed into a Category 5 hurricane and just grazed the northern coast of Luzon in the Philippines and then made landfall in China. Its peak wind speed was at Category 5 intensity, 160 miles an hour, not very strong either, 940 millibars the pressure, so not particularly deep. Two landfalls in the end. Its strongest one was 115 miles an hour Cat 3, that was in China, and it caused $1.5 billion of damages at the time, $2.3 billion today, 270 fatalities, but get that figure, 400,000 buildings damaged or destroyed there. Massive amount. Big cleanup after that, I'm sure.
Although this storm was only a slight breeze to New England as compared to the 1938 hurricane, Hurricane Donna took a very similar track to the 1935 Keys hurricane and ended up causing a lot of destruction in Florida. But not just there, while it was a Category 5 hurricane, it ended up impacting the Lesser Antilles in Puerto Rico as well. The damage total for the storm amounted to around $900 million, and the death total to be around 350, most of this coming in Florida. If a storm like Donna were to happen today, an estimated $31 billion would be caused by the system, not just to the destruction that would be caused in Florida, but also to the minor damages that would be caused in North Carolina and New England as well.
Up to 3 in 4 buildings at Marathon were destroyed, with a similar figure of damaged buildings in Fort Myers. In total, there were up to 400 fatalities throughout the storm's long path, and $900 million in damages, just short of becoming the first billion-dollar hurricane.
The 1938 New England hurricane is still regarded today as the worst storm to ever affect eastern New England and potentially western New England as well. It made landfall with winds of 120 miles an hour and pressure of 941 millibars, neither of which has ever been recorded before reliably in the area. The most notable thing that you can say about this storm was its forward speed. On September the 19th, hurricane warnings were being issued for the Floridian coast as they were expecting the storm to make landfall somewhere around Cape Hatteras. 36 hours later, the storm was off the New Jersey coast, and only 1 hour later, it would make landfall on Long Island. The storm is directly attributed to 600 deaths and over $41 billion in damages if the storm were to be recreated today.
Not to mention that over 50,000 buildings were devastated in the New England, the whole region, when the storm made landfall, first on Long Island, then on New England itself, still as a significant hurricane. What was the landfall intensity? Cat 3 perhaps? Certainly a strong one, which packed a mighty punch.
Hurricane Isabel is one of the most powerful hurricanes to ever exist in the Atlantic Basin. It was an extremely large Category 5 hurricane at its strength, and in the open Atlantic is the strongest storm on reliable records on my cyclone destructive potential scale. This storm would end up weakening and making landfall in the middle of North Carolina as a strong Category 2 hurricane, and is a very large storm. The storm moving inland did not cause that many deaths, only maybe around 50, but damages associated with the storm amounted to well over $5.5 billion. While it was in its third peak strength as a Category 5, the storm actually ended up exceeding its theoretical potential energy, which has not been seen by that many storms.
On top of that, 100,000 evacuees and 130,000 buildings damaged or destroyed across the US and beyond. And here's plenty of images of Isabel at and beyond its peak.
From what I know is that it started interacting with a cold front to the west, which started to deplete its eye wall structure and started making
trouble.
Yeah, it just started making the storm look bad, but it also greatly expanded the wind field of the system and just became this absolutely huge Category 2 hurricane at landfall. I mean, we're talking about the size of Hurricane Irene, if you remember that storm. Yep. And this storm also carried hurricane force winds well inland.
How far do you know?
I believe they're far enough that some of the cities in Virginia and southern and central Virginia experienced hurricane force winds.
And even Washington, D.C. had a little bit of flooding, didn't it?
Actually, flooding was really bad wherever this storm went. From North Carolina and South Carolina all the way up into Ontario, flooding was pretty bad.
Gosh,
but this Hurricane Isabel is certainly another storm that will go down in the record books as the Atlantic. It became a Category 5 on 3 separate occasions, though it wasn't really a Cat 5 for very long. It was a Category 4 hurricane for an extremely long period of time, I think nearing 4 days as a Category 4. And it just had this impressive structure the entire time, despite battling the hostile conditions of the Central Atlantic at the time.
At number 25 is 1978 Storm Rita in the Western Pacific. Typhoon Rita, passing just south of Guam and then eventually making landfall in the Philippines, reaching Category 5 intensity before that landfall. And what an intensity it reached as well, a remarkable low pressure of 878 millibars and a high wind speed of 175 miles an hour. At landfall it was only 110 miles an hour, it weakened a lot before it arrived in the Philippines. But it was still a terrible storm. $100 million of damages in real terms, nearly 300,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed, and over 650 people lost their lives in the end, most of those in the Philippines. Update 3 on what is now Super Typhoon Hagupit, Philippine name Ruby, and what a storm it is already, with winds of 180 miles per hour and a pressure of around 907 millibars. I'm sure most of us remember tracking Hagupit back in December 2014 when it made its ominous approach to the Philippines, and at first I think many people thought it may have been a repeat of Haiyan. It didn't turn out to be quite like that, but it did still turn out to be a very strong storm with winds of 180 miles an hour and a pressure of 905 millibars in the end, and weakened mercifully before its landfall on the island of Samar, and then it continued over the northern Philippine islands, passing just to the south of Manila as a tropical storm before heading out to sea and persisting for a few more days before dissipating completely not too far from the coast of Vietnam. So Hagupit reached its peak wind speed. It was one of several storms that year, 2014, to reach a wind speed of 180 miles an hour. The pressure, as I said, 905 millibars. It's more the damage that the storm caused. 125 miles an hour at landfall, by the way. That's still pretty impressive. $114 million in damages, 18 fatalities, unfortunately, and over 290,000 buildings damaged or destroyed. 240,000 of those damaged, the other 50,000 completely destroyed. An incomprehensible amount of numbers there. Here's some satellite imagery of the storm. Some fantastic images from the best quality satellites out there, or that were in 2014, just before Himawari arrived in the West Pacific. Imagine what it would have looked like on that. And there's another image of the storm. That's a very wide shot there, and there's an infrared view of the storm near its peak. And here's one from NASA, a fantastic high-resolution image there. This was its satellite progression as it churned through the West Pacific and crossed over those Philippine islands. It could have been a much worse storm. And here's some pictures of the damage. Okay, Typhoon Nancy, 1961 in the West Pacific, formed in September, I think it was. 215 miles an hour. Is that wind speed a reliable estimate?
It could be, it could not be. Most people know that the aircraft reconnaissance of the 1960 storms were erroneously high, more than likely. Though I think it could be believable, especially with a central pressure of 882 millibars. Typhoon Nancy, also known as the second Marutu typhoon, I believe it's the longest lasting Category 5 ever by a long shot.
I think Karen is close to Nancy, but I think Nancy still takes it.
Yeah, Nancy was a Category 5 for a total of 5.5 days, which is actually more than a day longer than Typhoon Karen.
Well, there we are. Typically, they're only Category 5s for about a day max, or a little bit more than a day.
Yes. Usually, storms undergo either an IOL replacement cycle or just run into hostile conditions very quickly. It's very, very difficult for a storm to last Category 5 for a significant amount of time.
So, does that bring in the question, was it a Category 5 the whole time?
Well, it might. Again, there's really no knowledge as to... the wind reports were just erroneously high from back in the 1960s, and I don't think we'll just ever know if the storm was a Category 5 the entire time. I think it's absolutely possible, because there was a typhoon in 2004 that lasted like 4 days. I can't remember its name. So it's definitely possible that storms can last this long, but very rare.
Alright. And it actually made 4 landfalls in the end as well. Its strongest one as a Cat 2, 100 miles an hour. Had it in for Japan, didn't it?
Yes, it did hit Japan. It made landfall on Hokkaido, I believe, and also made landfall on the main island, Honshu. It caused about 200 fatalities direct, although it really didn't impact any land, as it was a Category 5, which is certainly thankful, for 215 mile per hour winds. Imagine being in that. 215 miles per hour. Sheesh. And this is just a question I want to ask you, Nathan, especially with the passing of Hurricane Patricia now. do you think that it's possible that these storms could have had over 200-mile-an-hour winds?
I'm always open to that possibility, and in my opinion, until it's officially changed, you got to go with the official number, and the official number right now is 215.
I'm actually in agreement. I was usually skeptical about Nancy's 215, but I look at it now, I'm like, wow, 215. It probably did that.
You can never. Sometimes it continues to astound us, doesn't it? These storms, what they can actually do. Who'd have thought Patricia would ever get to 200 miles an hour, or indeed any storm in this time, in this era, would get to 200 miles an hour.
Typhoon, or tropical cyclone Gay, if you will, became, I'm pretty sure to this, became the first named storm in the Indian Basin to maintain a supercyclonic storm status. It crossed into the Indian Ocean after making it landfall as a Category 3 on the Malaysian Peninsula, and then crossed into the Indian Ocean, never lost hurricane status, and then as it neared its landfall in India, it decided to rapidly intensify into a Category 5, where it peaked with 160-mile-per-hour winds and a pressure of 930. The storm in the end ended up causing 902 deaths, with still about 150 not accounted for, so I guess you could say it crosses the grand mark, but considering other storms that have made landfall in India before, that number is certainly low for a Category 5, as you'll see later on.
Well, but there has been a few storms that have made strong landfalls there and didn't do too much. I mean, a recent example is Phelan, which made landfall at 155 miles an hour, only 45 fatalities.
Yeah, you gotta, sometimes it just hits the one part of the coast that isn't populated. That sometimes that happens, or the IMD actually put out good warnings for once.
Maybe.
Another possibility.
Let's not be too critical of the IMD, they might be watching.
I'm not going to do. From looking at it, Cyclone Gay was a very small system, it looks like. Probably about the size of Hurricane Andrew, if not smaller. As with most Indian storms, they tend to be rather small. I don't really have anything else to say other than...
when it did make landfall, Gay did cause over $500 million of damages at the time. It damaged 37,000 buildings, destroyed another 30,000, so it wasn't a good storm there. Even though the fatalities were, in comparison, rather light to what you'd sometimes expect there, it was still a pretty big financial cost, I suppose.
Certainly. Just one more comment. When it struck the southern coast of Andhra Pradesh, Typhoon Gay produced wind gusts of over 200 miles per hour, and a storm surge that was only 11 feet high, which is quite low for a Category 5. You would expect about 18 feet of storm surge from Category 5.
I suppose that was because of its quick intensification beforehand.
Quick intensification and very small size. Andrew didn't have that much of a surge either.
At number 21 is a hell of a storm called Nina in 1987 in the Western Pacific once more. And this storm became a ferocious Category 5 right next to the Philippines and made landfall at that intensity in Luzon. Remarkably strong landfall with winds of 165 miles an hour to peak with, and at landfall as well. The low air pressure 930 millibars, not as low as it could be, possibly because it was a quick intensification before that landfall. $85 million of damages, 176 in today's money. Nearly 1,000 people lost their lives, and over 300,000 buildings damaged or destroyed yet again. And half of those were destroyed completely. Terrible storm for the Philippines. Nina, number 21.